What's the difference in taking a bath and washing your feet? Well, we're going to find out in this episode, episode 21 of Salvation and Discipleship. If you've got your study guide, which you can get at simplybelief.com/grow, you'll notice that number 21 says, take a bath under salvation and wash your feet under discipleship. I remember when I was a kid, summer after summer, running around our yard and even our neighborhood barefoot. I remember coming in for dinner and finding that the bottoms of my feet were just absolutely black with dirt and stuff that they had picked up. Well, in our verses today, that is an aspect of life that we're going to look at. In the first century, when Jesus lived, the foot apparel was what we would call sandals, basically. They would travel by foot most of the time, and so their feet would get really dirty, just caked with dirt and mud. And so it was really common when you'd come into a house that you would need to have your feet washed by a servant, if there was a servant, or you'd do it yourself if there was no one to do it. And so in this chapter that we're going to look at, that Jesus and his disciples are in the upper room. It's the last night before Jesus is arrested and then crucified. And so he's having this final Passover feast with them. And so before the Passover feast, Jesus strips down to basically his underwear and starts washing the feet of his disciples, something that a rabbi or a master would not do. He would leave that to a servant. And so Jesus doing this raises some real questions. And we pick up Peter's question in verse 8 of chapter 13 of John. Let's see what Peter says here. Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash your feet, you have no part with me." It's important to understand what's going on here. Jesus isn't saying, Peter, you'll lose your salvation if you don't let me wash your feet. That's not what he's talking about. In fact, we already know that Peter was a believer from previous chapters in the Synoptic Gospels. So Jesus is saying here that you'll lose your role, your part as a disciple if you don't go along with this. And so that's really different than losing one's salvation, which you actually can't do. So what he's telling us here, to be part of what God is doing in the world, we need to go along with what Jesus is doing in our lives. And that was very true for Peter at this moment. It was very important that he allowed Jesus to do this thing. Now, when Peter hears this, and he knows, I don't want to lose my part, I don't want to lose the role that I'm playing as a disciple among Jesus' followers, so Peter overcompensates. Let's see what he says. Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." So Peter basically says, oh, well, if this is a needed thing for me to be a disciple, to play my part, then why don't you just go ahead and give me a sponge bath? He kind of overcompensates, so to speak, but it's great that he did because we learn a valuable lesson from Jesus' response. Let's see what Jesus says. Jesus said to him, "He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you." Man, so what's going on here? Well, Jesus affirms that 11 out of the 12 of them have already believed and have what we call positional forgiveness. We talked about that in the last chapter. You can go back and look at that if you need to. But positional forgiveness is what we get when we get saved. Notice what he says, that each of them has had a bath and they are completely clean. So in the judicial sense, in the legal sense, standing before God, they're forgiven of their sins and they don't need to seek that cleansing, that forgiveness, that confession. But he says here that those who have a bath still need to have their feet washed from time to time. We learned in the last chapter that we should be seeking daily forgiveness if we want to have fellowship with Christ. If we want to be close with Christ, be his disciples who obey, there are sins that we need to wash off. But we don't do that to have our salvation. Our salvation is set. We do that so that we can do what Jesus says here. We can play our part. We can have our role among his followers and his disciples. So he uses the analogy of a bath to represent salvation here. And he uses the analogy of foot washing to represent discipleship, in which we should be seeking forgiveness on a daily basis and seeking fellowship with both Christ and the other people around us. So it's a beautiful analogy that reminds us that we can't lose salvation, but there's something expected of us on a daily basis if we want to be good disciples. Well, if you want to go deeper on this subject, like all other chapters, there's way more in the book that I've written called Salvation and Discipleship. Also go to simplybelief.com/grow to learn more from this Bible study and to look at our other resources. Thanks for watching this episode, and I'll see you in the next.